last lap, folks. This is the last module, and we are going to focus on impact and how you begin to understand first and foremost, but then measure your impact. So if we dive right in, we like to think that thinking about impact in the context of collective impact work is both a result and it's a process of intentional innovation and learning. Not a huge surprise. And so therefore, when we set out to think about how might we capture measures to reflect impact, it's really important that they capture both aspects of that journey. And that by periodically pulling people together to reflect on and report on those insights and results is part of an important process to fuel and sustain momentum. And for us, there are 4 dimensions when we think about both the policy or the process and the impact that we like to think about. How do we help? How are we helping real people to live better lives? How are we learning together to achieve better outcomes? How are we making change simpler and more effective? And how are we addressing system barriers to generate a lasting impact? So those are the 4 broad quadrants that we like to think about when we think about impact. On to the next. So I love this because you'll see collective impact is sort of the driver at the bottom of this. And what we've got here is a number of innovations, small little prototypes of ideas bubbling along, and they're nudging up to the dominant established way of doing things where most of the resources and programs and practices live. But over time, as these 2 things start kind of interacting and shifting and changing, the other piece that's happening is, and we talked about this earlier this evening, those stories that we tell ourselves around what's possible or what always is or how someone always will be begins to shift. And what must be starts to shift. And then over time, that has a ripple effect that affects the broader landscape of the country as a whole, right? And a beautiful example of that long-standing shift would be if you look at the history around people's attitudes towards tobacco, right? Long time span, but initially there were a bunch of little, experiments with ads or with little kids campaigns, and then they started nudging against, bars and pubs about, can we all smoke or do we have to have a smaller place or whatever? And then over time, people's attitudes around whether smoking was a good thing or a not good thing started to shift. And now the landscape is completely different. My kids watch old movies and see people smoking all the time and they're horrified. Like they can't believe that it's happening. And you don't realize it, right? It's only when you look back that you see what a big shift it is that we've made. Okay, on to the next. So when you're thinking about impact, you can look at that in different levels, right? So this is sort of another take at coming at this. So our mission outcomes, to what extent are our efforts making lives better? So we have outcomes that we've achieved for individuals. We may have outcomes that we've achieved for specific groups or geographies or for whole populations. When you think about changing systems for lasting impact, you're saying, what are the things that are holding those systems in place? And how are we addressing those, right? How are we changing practice in the system? How are we changing attitudes and behaviors? How are we changing policies? And then also at the strategic learning level, how are we learning about what we're doing, what we're thinking, and what we're being? So you see how they all kind of intersect, but they're getting at slightly different things. On to the next. So there are 3 different types of learning that we can think about that contribute to having an impact. So the first is, what are we learning about what we're doing, right? And so early dialogues like what Paul was talking about through the mutually reinforcing activities, that's where some of those early insights start to percolate for one another, when you've got diverse perspectives coming together. You know, when we've got people who are recipients of our services sitting there, as Samantha, you were talking about, right? They start helping us to better see than we could ourselves what the limitations and strengths are of the services that we provide. But then we can go further, and that even the interaction between ourselves and the service, the people for whom we're providing service, those help us to start to recognize our own blind spots, our own assumptions about what's needed, about what works, about why people do or do not take advantage of the services that we offer. And then beyond that, you know, what are our assumptions? What are our attitudes, our mental barriers that get in the way? And how might we shift those? How might we become more open and accepting of certain things, and or embracing new norms through new relationships? What are the stories that the community is now telling itself that it didn't used to tell itself before? Okay, on to the next. So I like this. This comes from a really good resource developed by FSG, Social Impact Consultants, and it's a 3-part guide to how they approach evaluating collective impact. And the third of the 3 guides might be something particularly interesting for you to look at, because it's got tangible suggested, like some possible indicators you could use depending on what you were trying to measure. But the key lesson that you need to take away from this is what you are able to measure and report on in a collective impact initiative shifts and changes over time as your initiative grows and matures. So at the very early days, a lot of what you're going to be reporting on and measuring around impact is the processes. So how many people have you engaged? How many different perspectives? How many different programs and policies have now been mapped out that we're aware of? What, you know, to what extent have we documented the need within what populations? And so that's kind of the early stage work. Once you start actually getting into implementing things together through your collective impact initiative, that's when you start running into that middle realm of intermediate outcomes. So that's when you're going to start to be able to report on, we've made these policy changes. We've seen these shifts in how funding flows. We've seen these attitude shifts. We've seen these behavior changes. We've seen these, you know, those are the sort of midterm. And then it's not till much later that we can actually articulate impact in terms of how, you know, a population level shift or change or outcome for a group of people. So it's important to have these interim markers along the way so we can monitor our progress and test our assumptions. Okay, on to the next. So the tension that comes into play, most of us, when we think about things like evaluation and measuring results and impact, sometimes bring with it the mindset, first and foremost, of our accountability to a funder or to another entity to whom we're accountable, right? Did we implement the work as we planned? Did we meet the standards that were expected? Did we make the anticipated progress on the results we were being held accountable for? That's the dominant way many of us come at this look at impact and measurement. But there's a flip side, which is what we need in a collective impact project, because we are innovating, right? We are needing to learn as we go. And the kinds of questions that we would want to necessarily ask ourselves is, what are we learning about the changes and how to address them? What's working around our current system? What's not working? For whom? How? Why? And what's in and or out of our control in terms of affecting the system? And the problem, there's a flip side. So the inside are the core questions. The outside are the things that get in the way, the dark side of each of these things. But I think the more fundamental thing to be aware of is, are we collecting our data? Are we measuring our impact because it's driving our learning? Or are we dictating what we measure by what funders and or others are telling us we need to track to demonstrate accountability and progress? Because sometimes they are they work at cross purposes to one another. And so if you go to the next slide, what we ultimately want to be striving for is something in the middle that can satisfy funders and others to whom we're accountable that we're making good progress, but not done at the sacrificing of our own learning and understanding. So how do we share these results and also share how this is shifting and changing what we think is needed around addressing a particular issue? Okay, on to the next. So one of the other key pieces is, how do we think about failure? And there's something that's saying, you know, failure is only failure if we actually don't take the time to learn from what didn't work and understand why. So how do we, through our learning that we do for ourselves, create a discipline where when something doesn't go as expected, we don't see it as a mistake, but we see it as, that means that the way we understood the system wasn't correct. What's the assumption that we now need to challenge based on what we know? Hear the shift? If we go to the next, this is the realm of innovation, right? This is what you're ultimately trying to do with your collective impact initiative. You're trying to create that space to innovate. So what do we mean? When we're talking about innovation, we're talking about change for good, both with and within a community. It's change that the community has championed, and it benefits, it provides meaningful benefit to people of the community. We talk about it as a form of social innovation, but the benefit is it's rooted very much in a place, right? And it always is asking, how can we create, test, or bring in and scale up new approaches? And innovation is by its very nature distinct from and way more ambitious and uncertain than continuous improvement, right? We don't want, this is the transformational stuff. This isn't just making minor improvements on what the services that we've always delivered. On to the next. One of the early, one of the important measures that I think is interesting early on in a change effort is this notion of hope. So when you're looking at policy, an interesting baseline might be to get people to take a look at and assess their current level of hopefulness. So positive psychology has these 24 different strengths that they believe contribute to a person's ability to flourish. And of those, hope is one of the top predictors. And it is both, to be hopeful, you have to have two things. You have to have clear pathways laid out around how I can get to the place that I want to get to. And you also need to have the capacity, agency to be able to follow and commit to that path. And if you go to the next slide, what you'll see is that typically in many service agencies, we focus on reducing measuring sort of a reduction in a psychological problem as a marker of good progress. But recently, what they've started to say is, no, can we do a measure that of someone's desire to flourish? And that means that they will commit to doing something positive, maintaining positive relationships, commit to goals, and keep achieving them. If you go to the next, people with a low sense of hope don't get involved, right? So in many ways, we could design the most beautiful support system or support process for a person, but if they're not hopeful, they're not even going to show up to start the journey, right? And so that's why it's really important to get a measure of this. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is that, if you can pop forward one, Isaac. So people need to have both the pathways that we can help them create, and they need to have that sense of agency. And there's a scale, there's an adult version and a child version. They've been statistically validated. And they allow you to do a baseline right at the beginning that indicates person's degree of hopefulness. And if we're seeing changes in hopefulness over time, we know it'll be a good predictor to later taking action, but it can also be a quantifiable way of measuring and reflecting impact when a lot of the startup stuff might be process oriented, right? Because, you know, we've all seen the importance of relationship building and trust to moving this kind of work forward. But that's hard to quantify and hard to measure. Maybe this is a good metric for that kind of work. Okay. On to the next. You'll see there's a bunch of resources if you want to dig deeper into this HOPE index as one of those early measures for impact. All right, so do you want to see a couple of stories of how other collective impact initiatives have wrestled with this idea of measuring impact? Let's go. This one I love. So these are our friends in Palm Beach, Florida, the Palm Health Foundation. And they, several years ago now, recognized that to only fund acute care health initiatives was a mistake, because some of the core areas that were most in need in their county actually had issues related to social determinants of health that all the acute care health dollars in the world wouldn't fix. So what they did very audaciously is that they committed $200,000 per year for up to 6 years to 6 different areas of the county that had real high incidence in issues related to social determinants of health. And one of the rules of applying for this grant is that no agency could apply. It had to be an association of neighbors in the community who stepped forward to offer leadership around stewarding these dollars. There were some broad health promotion oriented sort of pillars that they could choose to focus their work on. But beyond that, they could hire a community agency to be the holder of their money. And they were allowed to hire a staff person that reported to them, the citizens. And beyond that, it was their job to figure out what to do. This was great. It took off. The 6 communities are going in very different directions. They've identified very different priorities, but they're very clear in their approach, and they're consistent in their approach, which is diverse players around the table, organizations and community residents. And then the foundation itself started to panic because they realized that their traditional metrics of monitoring and being accountable for good stewardship of dollars didn't fit, because what was coming up authentically from the communities was quite diverse, quite outside the box of what they would imagine. And oh my goodness, it was getting results. But how do we reflect that, right? How do we show due diligence? So they spent a lot of time really looking at a bunch of different opportunities and rationales for how they can do it. And they came up with 3 really powerful things that they tracked. The first is outcome wins. So they can tell you, as a result of our work, these are the number of people whose lives have been made better in these ways. Insight wins, which are these are things that we now understand about this issue that we didn't understand before, right? And the last one is capability wins. This is how new skills and capabilities are being built within and across community members to affect positive change. Fabulous, eh? So very different than our traditional results-based focus, but also very, very pivotal in terms of indicating readiness and leadership and community-driven change. Okay, here's another example. This comes from fabulous collective impact work in the city of Montreal in Canada. And the host of this project is Centre de Grand Montréal, which is the United Way. And what's beautiful about this is a couple of different things. They have 17 neighborhoods of the 35 neighborhoods in Montreal who have agreed and been funded to develop a neighborhood-based collective impact initiative. It has to somehow address issues of poverty, but not at all prescribed. So you'll see some neighborhoods have tackled affordable housing. Others have tackled educational success for newcomer children. Others have talked about inclusion of vulnerable adults. Others have focused on food security. So very, very different, very different priorities based on the priorities of that particular community. But they all know, and they all have to kind of connect the dots between the work that they're doing and the overall effort to reduce poverty, which I think is fantastic. They developed so Centrade was the capacity builder. So they taught lots of participatory evaluation practices and techniques to the neighbors so that they were evaluating themselves. And then the other really powerful thing about this particular approach is that in tandem with empowering these neighborhoods, they put together a collaborative table of 8 funders and also added to that 3 strategic partners, the City of Montreal Public Health, and the Coalition of Neighborhood Roundtables, because every neighborhood had a multi-sectoral roundtable already in place. Together, that network created a $23 million fund dedicated exclusively to these projects and made a 6-year commitment. So very powerful, because then the funders themselves are collaborating. They're learning about the power and challenge of collaboration. And we know that we've got dedicated funds for this work separate and apart from whatever the programmatic funds are that funders invest in across the city. But in terms of impact, they're able to speak neighborhood by neighborhood. This is the impact that we've had. But then they're also able, through their evaluation framework, to talk about the cumulative success of all of this knitted together. Okay, and a next one. This is work from the Vancouver Community Foundation, and what I like in how they've come at this notion of measuring impact is that they've kind of looked at it in sort of ripples. So the first one is we're looking at the first level of outcome is we've increased knowledge and capacity amongst different system actors. So interesting, right? Because it's similar to what the folks in Palm Beach did. We've really looked at how relationships and collaboration across and between system actors has shifted and changed in positive ways. And we're looking at new tools and resources available to support this collaborative type of work. Over time, what we are aiming to and expecting to see are improved practices and incremental progress towards lasting systems change, improved policies in the systems, incremental progress towards them. Could be funding flows in there as well. And then the final level of outcome is this shift, right? In attitudes, in behaviors, in narratives, in the culture of the community as a whole. And at the same time, you would start to see some population level changes as well. Does that help? Okay, if we go on to the next one, I think that brings us to an end of this component of the work. So just a quick question, if there are any additional thoughts and ideas about this before I put you into an exercise.
Sylvia, I have a question about
Sure.
the time frame, looking at when you talked about the early years and the intermediate or the first order and the second order. The time for systems to change or policies to change can be years, right? It may not.
That's right.
It can be years. So the patience to see this through, because if you want a mindset shift, this can take years.
Yes, but and it also underscores knowing that it's going to take years. Those can't be the only metrics that you're using to communicate your impact. That's part of the important message here. You know, you start with some of those process indicators, right? How have people's levels of hopefulness started to change? How many people have gotten involved? What are the the insight wins or the capability wins that are being grown? What new skills are being created? How many new, people are being trained or engaged? Those process measures become critically important exactly because, as you say, those longer term juicy impacts that everybody wants to see don't happen quickly. So what you have to do to both reinvigorate the commitment of the people around the table and also the confidence and commitment of those you're accountable to is other ways of demonstrating progress along the way.
Yeah. That means your collective impact leadership team stays with this process all the way till it does, right? It means if it's 10 years or 15 years.
No, not necessarily. So one of the
Okay.
things we would say, because nobody can really commit at 10 years, honestly, right? Like, where are
Yeah.
you going to be in 10 years, Charlotte? Really? So
Yeah.
you're not going to be lying on a beach, retired, feet up. No. So what we often do is we'll say to people, can you commit for 5 years? Can you commit to playing a leadership role for 3 to 5 years? And if you get a core group of people who agree to do that, then in about year 3, those people start thinking about, well, who else have we engaged now? Who should we be grooming, right? To step into leadership for the next phase. Some of the group in the first 5-year segment might be having such a good time, they decide to recommit for another 5 years, and that's fantastic. But that's another layer of what you're thinking about, right? You're always thinking about, can we get a solid enough commitment over a decent length of time to get some traction? And can we always be thinking about renewal? Make sense? Okay, here's what I would love to do.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I would like you to go into your small groups. And what I'm going to ask you to do is this. I am going to ask that you go quickly into your small groups, and let's take 10 minutes, not 15, thinking about these 4 dimensions of impact, and imagining the collective impact work you would like to do. What is some possible examples that would demonstrate impact, perhaps in each and or all of these 4 quadrants? Get as many as you can. Does that make sense? Okay. See you back in 10 minutes.
Welcome back, everyone.
That was probably just long enough to get a tiny little juicy taste of what we were talking about, I'm sure. Does anybody want to share something from your group? Samuel, how about you? What did your group talk about?
Actually, we talk about, my name is Samuel. Basically, HCSA, the part I'm involved in, High Point, will be, we are actually doing offending work, re-offenders, issue job offenders. So
Okay.
basically, yeah, we were thinking of how to, just now what you mentioned, the 4 rectangles of how, of certain measure impact that we need to do. So we are just discussing what kind of impact we like to do. Like, let's say if an ex-offender who came out from prison, maybe they first get a rental flat. So do we quantify that? We qualify that basically as we build on. Maybe after that 2-room own flat, or let's say employment. He starts as a cleaner. Do we become later? Does he become a cleaning supervisor or become a manager or own his own company? So how would kind of measurement be measured, lah? But then also the impact of it on the system itself, the whole system of the employment market and then of the housing market. So we actually discussed a bit on that, and it was quite interesting. But it was a very short session we have. Maybe we'll discuss.
I know. Yeah, but thank you for that. I think that's really helpful. You know, thinking about what I took from a lot of the markers was it was all about at first getting them rooted back in community, right? That's a key piece. So even if you don't have a lot of control over the market, just sort of seeing, more that when you do get them placed, they stay longer in a place, those kinds of things can also be positive markers as well. Anybody else? Any aha or insight you want to share? I know we don't have much time before we sign off, but would love to hear what came up in some of the other conversations. How about you, Alvin? What came up for your conversation?
Oh, hi. We're just discussing about what are the assessment tools, what instruments to use to gel and craft glue all these together. So we've talked about that extensively.
Beautiful. I think that's a big thing. It's one thing is to have the tools and methodologies, But the other thing is it's hard to do this in isolation of clarity around what your common agenda is going to be, right? And I think that's a
Absolutely,
great,
yeah.
all right. Can I turn it over to you, Mr. Paul Bourne, to take us away?
You sure can. And I just want to ask Sadhana the name of her dog. I love that.
She's a spoiled brat, and she's been kicking at the door to get into the room for the longest time.
Oh, there you go. And does it have a name?
She's Cookie.
Cookie. Lovely. Isaac was during the breaks, he was petting his cat. So it's lovely that people do that and bring them into your lives. I know we want to wrap up, and one of the things Joseph always likes to do is take a group picture. So can we all come on screen? That would be great. And Isaac, if you want to take that picture, that would be fantastic. Are we all on screen?
All right, smile, everyone.
Lovely to
So
see
this will take a
everyone.
minute, so just please keep smiling. Great, thanks, everyone.
It would be lovely just to have a short reflection as we wrap up. And I want to just, first of all, encourage you to continue to learn. There are so many ways to do that. You can be involved in Tamarack events. And, you know, if you see something you like at Tamarack, like a webinar, and you know, it happens while you're sleeping, of course, because we're 12 hours different, but just sign up for it, because we'll send you the link and then you can listen to it whenever you want. So if you register for something, we always send the link out later, and you can listen to the webinar at your leisure when you feel like it. So it works perfectly. You don't have to go live. You can get it and listen to it that way. So, and almost everything we produce online is free. We have some courses that are inexpensive, but mostly it's free. So come online and join us and learn some more. Sylvia, any last words to wrap up?
Just a great thank you for the energy everybody's brought, the curiosity, the questions, and the insights. It's been a pleasure learning with you all.
Nice. And if you are going to be implementing a collective impact process, I know that we are working with Joseph, and we are doing coaching. So if there's a group of you that wants to come together and you want to do one-on-one coaching, often what we do is we help pace your startup. We help take you through the various steps and try to say, okay, this month, what are we going to do? And then next month, and we kind of move things forward that way. And we try to problem solve. And in some ways, we know a lot of tricks to speed things up for you. So those are just some of the things that we need to say. Joseph, any last words to wrap up?
Thanks, Paul. So first and foremost, a big thank you to everyone who's dedicated. You know, it's about 9 hours of your life to the Collective Impact Masterclass. But I guess this is really just introduction to what things can potentially be like, because we are trying to see how we can sort of work together collectively on different initiatives along in Singapore. So I think some of you have asked, how do we keep in contact? Well, we do have the email contacts of everyone. So if everyone is fine here, we can sort of create an email group where everyone can be connected with each other. And like what Paul mentioned, there are resources in the website. There also there's availability of coaching, but for that we also will need to sort of find out the demand on this so that we can work closely with Tamarack in order how to schedule this better. Right. So that's all from me. Thank you, everyone.
Lovely. Well, thanks everyone. We could put you into another exercise if you would like, but I think we need to also wrap up and say good morning. It's almost time for lunch for you, almost time for sleep for us. You've been a wonderful, wonderful group. There's been so many smiles and you've been so engaged. We really appreciate it. Sylvia and I have shared about a half a dozen times through this training how much we've enjoyed you as a group. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Paul and
you,
Sylvia
Paul,
and Isaac. Thank you so
Sylvia,
much.
Isaac.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sylvia, Isaac.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.